So 5 moments in history where keeping your mouth shut was everything, where the fate of wars, empires, and individual human lives turned entirely on whether someone could manage to not say the thing. Welcome to the Mike and Mark History Experience. I am Mike Williams, screenwriter, historian, man who this week had to physically sit on his hands at the dinner table while his 16-year-old son Dylan explained to Monica that private property is, and I am quoting precisely, a colonial construct. I did not say the 17 things I wanted to say. I ate my food. I made eye contact with Monica, who was doing the same. We have been married long enough to communicate entirely in suppressed sighs. This episode is dedicated to that dinner and to everyone who has ever had 17 things to say and had the wisdom or the cowardice or the sheer exhaustion to say none of them.
I am Mark Donnelly, and I need to tell you immediately that I am personally, professionally, and apparently therapeutically invested in this topic. My therapist, and yes, I see a therapist, this is normal, everyone should do it. My therapist told me at our last session that I have a tendency to over-explain. I said I didn't think that was accurate, and then spent 11 minutes explaining why I didn't think it was accurate, and she just looked at me the way Valerie looks at me when I have proven her point. I work in television streaming. I have watched more careers end because someone could not stop talking than from any other cause. I have been that someone more than once. I am in the right place to have this conversation.
The thesis of this episode is not that silence is always right. History is full of catastrophic silences, people who should have spoken and didn't, complicit bystanders who stayed quiet while terrible things happened. We are not making that argument. We are making the more specific argument that there exist precise, identifiable moments in history where silence was the correct strategic choice, and the people who understood that changed outcomes. And we are also making the companion argument, which is that several of those people paid a price for their silence that we should not pretend was worth it.
We start in England, 1535. A man named Thomas More has been sitting in the Tower of London for over a year, and he has said almost nothing. Not because he had nothing to say. Thomas More was one of the most intellectually formidable people of the 16th century, a lawyer, a scholar, the Lord Chancellor of England, the author of Utopia, a man who had argued theology and law with the best minds of his era and generally given as good as he got. He had an enormous amount to say. He was choosing, with extraordinary legal precision and at considerable personal cost, not to say it.
The background, which requires a brief visit to the romantic history of Henry VIII, a man who approached the problem of an unwanted wife the way a studio executive approaches an unwanted plotline, which is to say, by simply eliminating it and moving on, and who did this with a consistency that eventually became its own genre of English history. Henry wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon. The Pope declined to assist. Henry decided that if the Pope would not give him what he wanted, the sensible solution was to become the Pope of England, which he effectively did by declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. He then required every person of consequence in the kingdom to swear an oath acknowledging this. Thomas More, who was Henry's Lord Chancellor and close personal friend and the finest legal mind in the kingdom, refused, and then he refused to say why.
This is the move. More understood something that panic would have caused most people to miss entirely. Under English law at that time, you could not be convicted of treason for a thought you had not expressed. You could be suspected, imprisoned, ruined financially and socially, stripped of everything, but you could not be hanged for a belief that existed only inside your skull, unexpressed. So More decided to keep the belief inside his skull. He sat in the tower, wrote polite letters about the weather in his garden, engaged in carefully neutral theological discussion, and refused to produce a single sentence that could be used against him. For over a year, this worked.
The pressure on More during this period was extraordinary, and I want to be specific about it, because it is easy to describe his silence as a legal tactic and miss that it was also a form of sustained personal anguish. His daughter Margaret, who was by all accounts one of the most intelligent women of the Tudor era, educated to an unusual degree by More himself, genuinely his intellectual companion wrote him letters begging him to just swear the oath. She told him God would understand a public profession made under duress. His son-in-law made the same argument. His friends, his former colleagues, the entire social world that had once been his, all of them sent some version of the same message. Say the words, go home, God knows what is in your heart. He refused. And he refused in silence without explaining his refusal to the people who loved him, because explaining it would have created evidence, and evidence was the one thing he could not afford to give them.
The decision point. Over a year into his imprisonment, with the government's frustration mounting and Henry's patience entirely exhausted, More had three options. 1. Swear the oath. Say the words. Go home to Margaret and his grandchildren and his garden at Chelsea. His friends said God would understand. 2. Publicly refuse and explain why. Make the full argument in the open. Go down as a martyr with his theological and legal case on the record for posterity. 3. Continue the silence. Maintain the legal fortress. Force the Crown to construct a treason case against a man who had given it nothing to work with. He chose 3. And for over a year, 3 was winning.
And then Richard Rich happened. Richard Rich was the Solicitor General of England, which is a prestigious legal office that Rich occupied despite being, by all surviving historical accounts, a man of such comprehensive untrustworthiness that his contemporaries documented it repeatedly, and his reputation has not improved in the intervening 5 centuries. He visited More in the Tower and had a private conversation with him. At More's trial, Rich testified under oath that during this conversation, More had explicitly denied the king's supremacy. More's courtroom response was one of the great moments in the history of legal self-defense. He named specific occasions on which Rich's dishonesty had been documented. He argued, with cold precision, that Rich was a man whose testimony no reasonable person should credit on any subject. He was articulate, specific, and entirely correct. The jury deliberated for 15 minutes and convicted him anyway. More was executed on July 6th, 1535.
The silence that had protected him for over a year was defeated not by anything More said, but by someone else's claim about what he had said in private, which is a specific and particular kind of nightmare, the nightmare of the person who maintains perfect silence and is destroyed anyway by attributed words. And Richard Rich went on to a career that I find genuinely offensive in its success. He became enormously wealthy. He served multiple subsequent monarchs with no apparent difficulty. He was elevated to the peerage. He died in his bed at an advanced age, in full possession of everything he had accumulated. The universe, in this instance, took a very long afternoon off from the concept of justice.
My reading of More's silence is that it was the correct legal strategy and would have worked against any government that played by its own rules. The fact that it was defeated by perjury is not a failure of the strategy. It is evidence that Richard Rich was a rat and that Tudor courts had limits. Mark's reading.
My reading is that More's silence was legally brilliant and personally devastating because it required him to die without having made the argument he most believed in. He never got to say, in his own voice, in public, that Henry was wrong, that the church mattered, that some things were worth more than a king's convenience. History made that argument for him afterward. He went to his death having never made it himself. And I find something genuinely sad about the most eloquent man in England dying because he chose not to speak. We will be right back.
Welcome back. Before we get into the Roman conspiracy, I want everyone listening to think about the last secret they were asked to keep that involved more than 3 people. Take a moment. Because 60 Roman senators in the most gossip-saturated city in the ancient world kept a murder plot secret for weeks. Not a rumor, a murder plot. With weapons, assigned roles, and a specific date. If you have ever been in a surprise party planning committee of more than 4 people, you understand what an achievement this was.
The conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 before the Common Era, involved somewhere between 60 and 80 senators, depending on your ancient source. It involved planning meetings, weapons acquisition, and distribution. A coordinated post-assassination strategy, including who would address the Roman people and what they would say, and it held for weeks, possibly months. In Rome, a city whose entire social infrastructure was built on information exchange, whose aristocratic class attended dinner parties 4 nights a week, whose morning ritual involved queuing at your patron's house to exchange news and favours, whose greatest literary figure, Cicero, could describe a conversation from the day before from his villa outside the city. In that environment, 60 people kept a secret.
The organisational genius was primarily Gaius Cassius Longinus, who Shakespeare immortalised as the lean and hungry man, and who was, in historical reality, a capable naval commander with genuine organisational skill and a serious grudge. And Cassius understood the fundamental principle of secret keeping, the framing. He did not tell 60 senators that he wanted to kill Caesar because he was jealous of Caesar's power and found Caesar personally irritating, which appears to have been at least part of the truth. He told them they were going to restore the Roman Republic. They were not conspirators, they were liberators. The word did significant psychological work in keeping 60 men from talking, because men who believe they are doing something noble are considerably better at keeping quiet about it than men who know they are doing something wrong.
The social reality of what these 60 people had to manage for weeks is something I think deserves a moment. They had to attend Senate meetings with Caesar. They had to conduct the normal business of Roman political life, the dinners, the salutations, the conversations in the forum, while knowing what they were planning. They had to look Caesar in the face, repeatedly, and maintain the performance of ordinary political collegiality. Some of them had been Caesar's allies, his beneficiaries, men he had promoted and pardoned. Brutus had been shown unusual generosity by Caesar for years, and they all had to act normal for weeks. That is not a legal strategy like Moore's. That is a sustained theatrical performance under conditions that would have broken most people within days.
The decision point as the Ides approached, the conspirators had 3 options, and the pressure to choose was mounting because the situation was showing cracks. 1. Proceed on schedule, March 15th, as planned, in the Theatre of Pompey where the Senate was meeting that day. 2. Abort. The plot had been generating rumours. A soothsayer, whose name Spurina is recorded, had warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March, which either suggests remarkable prescience or a man who had heard something he was not supposed to hear. Calpurnia had dreamed of Caesar's death and begged him not to go. If a single senator broke under the pressure, everyone died. 3. Delay. Add more members to shore up the wavering ones, reset for a different occasion. They chose 1. They went on the Ides. The silence held until the moment Servilius Casca's knife came out, and Casca, apparently nervous under pressure, missed the neck and hit the shoulder, which is the most humanizing detail in the entire assassination narrative.
And here is the detail that I find most striking about the whole operation. The silence of 60 men was very nearly broken from outside the conspiracy. Artemidorus of Cnidus, a teacher of rhetoric who had somehow learned of the plot, wrote the relevant information on a piece of paper and pressed it into Caesar's hand as he entered the building. Caesar took the note. He did not read it. He was holding it when the daggers came out. The warning existed. The 60-person silence had been partially penetrated. Caesar just did not look down. And I think about that specific detail, the warning in the hand, unread in the context of every organization I have ever worked in, where someone has tried to tell the most powerful person in the room something they did not want to know, and the powerful person simply did not look down. It happens constantly. Caesar was not uniquely blind. He was humanly, ordinarily blind, and it killed him.
Now, from the most successful collective silence in ancient history to one of the most interesting individual silences of the 20th century. But first, I want to note something about the Roman material that I keep coming back to as a screenwriter. The thing that makes the conspiracy work dramatically is not the plot, it is the performance. 60 people having to sit across from the man they are planning to kill and behave normally. That is the scene. That is the thing. You cannot write unless you understand what it costs a person to maintain a face. And I think about that every time I am in a notes meeting being told something I think is completely wrong about my script, nodding and writing it down and saying thank you. That is very useful. That is a much smaller version of what those senators were doing. Much smaller. But the mechanism is the same.
Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Imperial Japanese Navy. 1941, the man who planned Pearl Harbor, the man who predicted before he planned it exactly how it would end.
Yamamoto had spent significant time in the United States. He had studied at Harvard as a special student, an extended period of serious academic engagement, not a degree program. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen American factories, American shipyards, American oil production at scale. He understood what American industrial capacity meant for a prolonged Pacific War in a way that almost none of his colleagues did, because almost none of them had been there to see it. And when the decision was being made to attack America, Yamamoto told the high command that he could promise them 6 months of victories. After that, he could promise them nothing. The American industrial machine would replace everything faster than Japan could sink it. The end would be catastrophe.
He said this, clearly, specifically, to the people who had the authority to hear it and act on it. They overruled him. And then this is the key moment he stopped saying it. He received his orders. He planned Pearl Harbor with extraordinary tactical precision. He executed it, and from the moment the orders were confirmed, the reservations disappeared from every record. He became the instrument of a policy he had opposed with everything he had.
And I want to make both arguments about this because I find them both genuinely compelling and I cannot fully choose. The argument for Yamamoto's silence, the decision had been made through legitimate command authority. A military commander who continues to obstruct a decided operation is not being principled. He is causing additional damage, and his obstruction has costs not just for himself, but for every person under his command. The decision was made. The best he could do for the people executing it was to be the best possible version of the commander leading them. The argument against, he knew, not suspected knew, with the specificity of someone who had done the arithmetic on American steel production and understood what it meant. His silence was not the silence of a man persuaded he was wrong. It was the silence of a man who had decided that being right was no longer a sufficient reason to keep talking. And that is the kind of silence I find most uncomfortable, not cowardly, not dishonest, but the silence of expertise voluntarily withdrawn.
The coda. After Pearl Harbor, after Midway, where 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk in a single battle and the strategic situation of the Pacific War changed permanently. After it became clear that Yamamoto's prediction was unfolding exactly as he had described it, there is no record of him saying, "I told you so." No letter, no diary entry, no comment recalled by any subordinate. He remained silent about his own prescience through the entire period in which events were confirming it. He was killed in April of 1943 when American P-38 fighters, acting on intercepted signals intelligence, ambushed his transport plane over Bougainville. He died, as far as we can reconstruct, having never once said to anyone, "I predicted this. This is what I predicted." The silence after being catastrophically proven right might be the most remarkable silence in this entire episode, and I am genuinely unsure whether it represents integrity or something more like despair.
I think it was both. And I think those two things are not incompatible. We will be right back.
See you soon.
Welcome to part 3, April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. More than 100,000 Union soldiers are in the vicinity. The Civil War is effectively over. The war that killed somewhere between 600,000 and 750,000 Americans, more Americans than all of the country's other wars combined up to that point, is done. And Ulysses S. Grant has just ordered his army to be completely quiet.
No cheering, no celebrations, no artillery firing in triumph, no music. Grant's order, as recorded by his aide Horace Porter, was that the rebels were now their prisoners, and he would not exult over their downfall. They were our countrymen again. And he enforced this. That order travelled down through the command structure to more than 100,000 men who had just won the bloodiest war in American history and who were being instructed, "Do not celebrate."
To understand what Grant was asking, you have to understand what this army had been through in just the previous 12 months. The Overland Campaign of 1864, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse. Cold Harbor had produced casualties on a scale that shocked even men who thought they had become accustomed to mass death. At Cold Harbor in June of 1864, the Union Army lost approximately 7,000 men in the first hour of fighting. 7,000 men in 1 hour. These were men who had watched friends die in ways that remain difficult to describe. They had been cold, hungry, sick, and under fire for years, and now they were standing in the presence of the army that had made all of that necessary, and Grant was saying, "Not a sound."
Most of them obeyed. There are individual accounts of spontaneous cheers breaking out in distant parts of the Union line and being stopped by officers. There are accounts of men weeping not in triumph but in something more complicated, the mixture of relief and grief and exhaustion that is the actual emotional experience of the end of an enormous, terrible thing. But at Appomattox itself, in the direct presence of Lee's surrendering troops, the silence held. And I want to pause on the human difficulty of that for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. More than 100,000 men, many of them in their 20s, ordered not to cheer when they had just won. The discipline of that is extraordinary. The fact that they mostly managed it is, I think, as much a tribute to what they had lost as to what they had gained. They were too tired and too sad to celebrate. The silence was partly an order and partly grief.
The decision point for Grant. 3 options in the moment of Lee's surrender. One, let the celebration happen. It was earned. 4 years of the most brutal war in American history had just ended in Union victory. Human beings who have one thing celebrate that is not a failure of character, that is a human response to the end of suffering. 2, order a formal military ceremony of triumph. Flags, music, the full historical theatre of a great army acknowledging its victory and its defeated adversary. The Union had won. A formal ceremony was appropriate and would have been understood internationally. 3, silence, no ceremony, no celebration, go home. He chose 3. And it was, I would argue, the most consequential decision of his personal career.
Here is the full case for Grant's silence, and I want to make it properly because it usually gets skipped in favor of what came after. It was Lincoln's vision made real. Lincoln had been explicit. He wanted the armies home. He wanted the men to take their horses for the spring plowing. He wanted the South given away back into the Union that did not require total humiliation. Malice toward none was not just a phrase, it was a policy. And Grant, on that afternoon at Appomattox, enacted that policy at the moment of maximum emotional pressure, when the temptation to do the opposite was at its highest. You judge an act by what was achievable in the moment it was made. In that moment, with those men, after that war, the silence was the right call. Full stop.
And I want to push back on what I think is the implicit standard Mark is about to apply, which is judging the silence at Appomattox by the 100 years that followed it. That is not how you evaluate a decision. You evaluate it against what the alternatives were in that room on that afternoon, with the information and the tools and the political reality available to Grant at that moment. The alternative was not a silence that magically produced successful reconstruction. The alternative was a celebration that poisoned the reconciliation before it started. Grant chose correctly. What came after is a separate failure by separate people in separate circumstances, and I am not going to hang it on an order not to cheer.
The standard you just described, judge the act by what was achievable in the moment, is a perfectly reasonable standard if you are the one making the decision. It is a much harder standard to apply if you are one of the 4 million people who had been enslaved and for whom the achievable in the moment kept being not enough, decade after decade. And each time the people making the decision said, "We did what was possible given the circumstances." My argument is not that Grant was wrong to order the silence. My argument is that the silence gets remembered and celebrated and written about, while the decades of insufficient follow-through get filed under complicated legacy. And the people who paid for the insufficient follow-through do not get to invoke what was possible in the circumstances. They just paid.
Okay. That is not an argument I can fully answer, and I'm not going to pretend I can. The silence at Appomattox is one of the most moving moments in American history. Mark is also right that the people who needed more than a moving moment did not get what they needed. I am going to hold both of those and not resolve them because I do not think they resolve. On that note, we will be right back.
Yep. See you soon.
Welcome to part 4, and I want to tell you about the one time Dwight Eisenhower broke his own rule. Eisenhower had organized D-Day, the largest military operation in human history, through meticulous planning and extraordinary information control. He understood the value of saying nothing when nothing was the right thing to say, and in May of 1960, with 8 months left in his presidency and a genuine shot at a historic arms reduction agreement with the Soviet Union, he chose to tell the truth in public. It cost him the summit he had spent years working toward. The consequences outlasted his presidency.
The background requires a brief introduction to the U2, which is not a rock band, and I say that specifically because my son Ronald, who has a theatre arts degree and therefore extensive opinions about everything cultural, spent 15 minutes at a family dinner explaining to me that the U2 spy plane was actually named after the band, which is exactly backward, and I did not have the energy to correct him because sometimes the silence is just the easier choice. The U-2 was an American reconnaissance aircraft that had been flying over Soviet territory since the mid-50s. On the 1st of May 1960, one piloted by Francis Gary Powers was brought down over Soviet territory. Powers survived. The Soviets captured him, the intact aircraft, its cameras, its film, and its pilot, who was alive and entirely capable of explaining what he had been doing.
The standard playbook was obvious, well-established, and would almost certainly have worked. Deny everything. Weather research plane, navigation accident, express concern for the missing pilot. The Soviets could not expose the American spy program without revealing the full extent of their own air defense capabilities. And crucially, Nikita Khrushchev wanted the Paris summit. He had positioned himself domestically as a man who could achieve peaceful coexistence with the Americans. He needed the summit as much as Eisenhower did. The diplomatic fiction could have survived. All Eisenhower had to do was maintain it.
3 options for Eisenhower. 1. Deny everything. Weather plane. This was the CIA's recommendation, the State Department's recommendation. The recommendation of essentially everyone whose job involved managing international crises and who understood that maintaining strategic ambiguity was not lying, it was statecraft. 2. Acknowledge the incident in carefully chosen terms, express regret without admitting intent, allow the summit to proceed on the mutual fiction that both sides could maintain. 3. Publicly admit that the United States had been running deliberate surveillance flights over the Soviet Union, take personal responsibility as the authorizing authority, and refuse to apologize for it. He chose 3.
And here is the thing about why he chose 3, because it matters for understanding whether the choice was right or wrong. By the time Eisenhower made this decision, NASA had already issued a public statement about a weather research plane. The Soviets had already publicly produced the pilot, the plane, and the photographic evidence that demonstrated the weather plane story was false. Eisenhower was not choosing between strategic silence and honesty. He was choosing between honest admission and the continuation in public, in front of every government and every journalist in the world, of a lie that had already been demonstrably, visibly, and completely exposed. He decided he would not do that. He admitted it. He took responsibility. And Khrushchev, who had been prepared to let the whole thing quietly die in the service of the summit he needed, now had no domestic political choice but to blow it up.
The Paris summit of 1960 collapsed before it properly began. Khrushchev arrived, delivered a theatrical denunciation, demanded a formal apology, did not receive one, and left. The possibility of a genuine arms reduction agreement, real de-escalation of the kind that would not actually happen until Nixon and Kissinger more than a decade later, was gone. Kennedy inherited a Cold War that was specifically, measurably colder than it had needed to be. The Cuban Missile Crisis was more than 2 years away. Historians still argue about whether a successful Paris summit would have prevented it.
Here is where Mark and I genuinely disagree, and I want the disagreement to be specific. My position is not that Eisenhower was wrong, to be honest. My position is that the failure was not the honesty. The failure was the cover story that preceded the honesty. The sequence was incident, false cover story publicly exposed, belated honesty. If the administration had responded to the Powers incident with something strategically ambiguous, neither confirming nor denying, expressing concern for the pilot, neither claiming weather research nor confirming espionage, the summit might have survived. Khrushchev needed a fiction he could believe, not a truth he had to respond to. The administration gave him the truth in the worst possible way, after having already lied.
I think that is correct, and I want to add the thing it leaves out. Eisenhower's admission was the right thing in a moral sense. He stood behind his orders, he took responsibility for a decision he had made, he refused to hide behind a cover story that had already failed. That is a version of integrity. And it cost him something real. The lesson I take from the U2 story is not that honesty is always wrong. The lesson is that the time to think about what you are going to say is before the crisis, not after. Eisenhower was living with the consequences of a decision, the cover story that had been made reflexively and without thinking through what would happen when it failed. The silence or the strategic ambiguity needed to be the first choice. Once you have lied, the truth becomes expensive.
And this brings us to the present day, and the question underneath this entire episode. In a world where everything is recorded, where information moves at the speed of a social media post, where private conversations end up in screenshots and group chats leak, and nothing stays concealed for long, is the kind of silence we have been talking about today even possible? Moore's silence worked for over a year, because legal procedure was slow and information was slow, and the Crown needed an expressed word before it could act. The Roman conspirators' silence worked for weeks because there was no mechanism for rapid dissemination of political secrets. Yamamoto's silence held until his death because the deliberations of the Japanese high command were not reported in real time. Grant's silence was experienced by the people present and reported by journalists who filed stories that took days to reach the public. Every silence in this episode was made possible by the gap between events and the world knowing about them.
That gap is now effectively zero. A private conversation in a closed room can be on 100 million screens within an hour. Moore's legal fortress would be breached by a single recording. The 60 Roman senators would have a group chat, and within the first week, someone would screenshot something and send it to exactly the wrong person. Yamamoto's assessment of American industrial capacity would be leaked to an investigative journalist within 48 hours of delivery. Grant's order not to cheer would be argued about on social media before Lee's troops had finished filing out. The mechanisms that made silence possible in every single case we have discussed today, the friction of information, the slowness of communication, the gap between what happened and what the world knew no longer exist.
And yet, here is my actual argument, which Mark is about to push back on. The value of silence has not decreased. If anything, it has increased. In a world where every platform is designed to reward the fastest response, the loudest voice, the most inflammatory take, the person who can simply not respond has a genuine strategic advantage that is rarer than at any previous point in history. The discipline Moore showed, not giving your enemies what they need, is more valuable in the current environment than in any era he inhabited. It is just harder to maintain because the pressure to respond is constant and the tools for response are in your pocket at all times. The people who can still do it, who can let the moment pass, who can not send the message, not take the bait, not explain themselves when explanation would only make things worse, those people still win the arguments that matter. Ask Dylan.
My pushback is this. Moore's silence was possible because his enemies needed his spoken words to convict him. The modern environment does not need your words. It has your metadata, your location history, your email from 11 years ago, your social graph, your browsing history, and the ability to construct a narrative about you from publicly available sources that does not require your active participation or your voice at all. The silence that protected Moore protected him because the legal system required testimony. The surveillance infrastructure of the present does not require testimony. It constructs its own. Dylan has never said a word to you directly about his views on property. You still know exactly what he thinks. The silence is no longer the protection it was. What is needed now is something Moore never had to develop. The ability to live authentically in a world that can see everything, and to be the kind of person who does not need the silence because there is nothing that requires concealment. That is harder than anything Moore did in the tower, and most people are not managing it.
Okay, so the thing is, that is a better argument than I walked in with, and I am going to sit with it rather than concede it immediately, which is my process, as Mark is aware. Read Barbara Tuchman's The March of Folly. It is the definitive account of what happens when power systematically refuses to hear what it does not want to hear across 4 centuries and pays for it each time. Read Robert Caro's Master of the Senate. It is the most detailed examination in American literature of a man who understood when to speak and when to be completely silent and used both as weapons of extraordinary precision. Tell one person about this show today. Specifically tell the person in your life who cannot stop talking. They need it more than anyone. From the Mike and Mark history experience, I am Mike Williams.
And I am Mark Donnelly. 5 silences. Moore in his tower, holding his tongue while Richard Rich sharpened his lie. 60 senators eating dinner with the man they were going to kill and asking him how he slept. Yamamoto watching his prediction arrive on schedule and saying nothing about it to anyone. Grant ordering 100,000 exhausted men not to cheer, and most of them finding they couldn't anyway. Eisenhower telling the truth at exactly the wrong moment and discovering that integrity without timing is just expensive honesty. None of them were entirely wrong. All of them paid. The lesson is the same one it has always been. Know the difference between the moment that needs your voice and the moment that needs your silence. Understand you will sometimes get it wrong. And understand that history will record the choice and the cost with no sentiment whatsoever and move on. That is history. That is us.